We're going to start our examination of change with the change in the American West. The West was primarily a supplier of raw materials and food for the industrializing North and East. Among the most important parts of this development were the railroads, and particularly the Transcontinental Railroad, the first railroad to reach from California to the east. But there were people living in these plains areas, and so what was going to become of Native Americans? There was a mining frontier that supplied precious metals for industrialization. There was the cattle kingdom that provided food for factory workers. And then I want to take a minute and just ask about the impact of the myth of the cowboy, not actually what happened historically, but the myth that has grown up around the cowboy. And I want to pose the question for you, does it make a difference in the way Americans act? Discussion of the Transcontinental Railroad began before the Civil War, but the North and South split over where the eastern end of it should be. And so nothing got built until the South seceded. Then Congress, controlled by the North, passed a series of Pacific Railroad Acts that provided free land for the railroad companies who were going to build the tracks and paid them thousands of dollars per mile of track laid. This allowed private companies using federal money to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It also allowed the railroads to prosper because many of these land grants that were given to them were vast acreages, much more than was needed to simply put a rail line in. And so the railroads, after they built the rail line, could then sell off the land around the railroad tracks and make more money. Now keep in mind that they did not have things like front-end loaders, earth movers. So the vast majority of this railroad was built over 2 mountain ranges, or through 2 mountain ranges, or around 2 mountain ranges, by hand, with picks and shovels and the muscle of men. This gang labor required tens of thousands of men, and men from all over the world, not just the United States, came to get a job building the railroad. There were immigrants from Europe, but there were also immigrants from Mexico and China who had a hand in building the railroad, not to mention former slaves who moved west to get away from their old plantation owners and found a job building the railroad. One of the major issues in building the railroad was that there were already people living in many of the areas through which the railroad was built. These were the Native Americans who had lived there and hunted there for centuries. But in large measure, their needs were not met by the railroads. In fact, the railroad became very instrumental in the decline of the Native American way of life. With all of these thousands of men working at manual labor all day, food became a big priority, and there was a ready source of food for the railroads. The massive herds of buffalo, millions of them, that roamed the Great Plains. And so the railroads began to hire buffalo hunters to go out and kill buffalo to provide meat for the workers. They also found a market for the hides of the buffalo. It became very stylish to have coats and hats made from buffalo skin. But in killing off the buffalo to feed the workers, the United States discovered something else. They were depriving the Native Americans of their primary source of food. The Plains Indians had for centuries lived because of the buffalo. It provided food, it provided clothing, it provided skins for their teepees, the bones provided tools, and so the buffalo was essential to the Native American life of the Plains Indians. And as this video explains, the federal government began to use this to weaken the Native Americans, to make it so that they could not resist whites moving into their territory, because they starved the Indians. Even once the railroads were built and the need for food was not that great, there was a buffalo hunting industry that virtually wiped out the buffalo. It almost became extinct. And part of the reason for that continued slaughter of the buffalo was to starve the Indians. While there were some back east who opposed killing off the Indians, it became kind of the standard for life in the West. The slogan was, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." And so there were a series of massacres that further weakened the Native Americans' ability to resist the policies of the United States government. One of these happened during the Civil War at Sand Creek, Colorado. The chief of this particular group had just returned from Washington, D.C., where he had met personally with Abraham Lincoln and had been promised peace. And so when he returned to his followers, he flew the peace flag that had been given to him by Abraham Lincoln, and an American flag. But that did not stop the cavalry from at dawn one morning charging into the village and massacring men, women, and children. The killing of Native Americans, some of whom called this genocide, was another way that the federal government tried to force the Native Americans to move onto land provided to them by the government, but which at the time no whites really wanted, in what became known as reservations. Many of the Plains tribes fought back, the Sioux in particular, and they had some victories. For instance, the famous battle at the Little Bighorn. This was Custer's last stand, where the 7th Cavalry was surprised by the Native Americans and slaughtered. But any Indian victory just renewed the efforts of the U.S. Army to stop their freedom. And perhaps the last major domino to fall in forcing Indians onto the reservation came at Wounded Knee, where the army surrounded an Indian village, and using artillery and the Gatling gun, the predecessor to the machine gun, they wiped out virtually every Indian in that village. And in many ways, this was the end of Native American resistance to American policies and Americans taking over their land. So as this video indicates, Native American resistance to white expansion was stopped. Most Indians were forced onto reservations where they were expected to become like Americans, to be farmers, to be individual entrepreneurs. But that was not the Native American way of life. Particularly on the plains, they had been hunters. They had been warriors. And now that way of life was taken away, and whites expected the Indians to learn to live like the white man did. A further attempt to Americanize Native Americans, if you will, was the Dawes Act. One of the great sources of tension between Native Americans and Europeans from the very beginning was that Native Americans did not see land as private property. To them, land was for whoever used it. It was like trying to own air in the Indian way of thinking. And so when the Dawes Act basically split up the reservations into individual family farms, many Indians didn't understand that. This was an attempt to make Native Americans become like the American farmers, with no concept of private property or land as property. When white men came along and wanted to buy Indian land, the Indians thought they were just giving away money. The Dawes Act also allowed the federal government to take back millions of acres of land that had originally been given to the Indians as reservations, because now they allotted each Indian family a plot of land and then took back the rest of the reservation to be sold to white settlers. So as this video explained, the Dawes Act was seen by Native Americans as one of the great betrayals of all time, because they had been given land forever only to see it taken away from them. Another thing that drew settlers to the West was the so-called mining frontier. You probably remember the great California gold rush, where gold was discovered in 1848. And literally tens of thousands of men from all over the world flocked to California to try to get rich. Well, this played out again and again through the West, not only when it came to gold and silver, but also to other precious metals. And these precious metals, such as copper and nickel and coal, became vital to the growth of industrial America back east. Some of you at some time may have gone to a park where they allowed you to pan for gold. This was the way the prospectors started. They would go out and they would stand in these cold mountain streams for days on end, scooping up the sand and gravel off of the bottom of the creek, and then allowing the water to wash away the dirt from the pan. And because gold was heavier than dirt, the gold stayed in the pan while the dirt flowed away. But not very many people got rich by doing this. When these prospectors found a promising place where they were getting a lot of gold by panning, they often built slough boxes or rockers where they could shovel in big shovelfuls of the riverbed and then wash the water over it to be able to look for gold more efficiently. But the gold that these prospectors would find in the riverbeds and streams was just what had run off from the major source of the gold. And in most cases, that was hidden underground, the main vein of the gold, as it was called. And some were able to dig mines to try to get at the main source of the gold. But very quickly, mining became a corporate operation because it took money to dig mines. It took money to excavate whole mountains. And in some cases, the corporations devised ways to use water pressure. And they would use this water to wash away whole hillsides so they could get at the gold more easily. But of course, all that dirt that they washed away washed down into the streams and rivers and caused a huge environmental problem as all of this dirt clogged up the rivers and caused flooding. Another way to make a living was by raising cattle. And the so-called cattle kingdom, which really started in South Texas, became the source of food, of beef, for all of those factory workers in the cities of the North and the East. The problem was the cattle were no place close to where the railroads were. And so the cattlemen had to devise ways to get their stock from South Texas up to the railheads, first at Sedalia, Missouri, then Abilene, Kansas, Ellsworth, Kansas, Dodge City, Kansas, and ultimately to Fort Worth. Now, one of the things you need to remember is that being a cowboy was really Spanish. The Spaniards were the first to herd cattle on horseback in the Americas, and many of the means of cattle herding come from the Spanish and the Mexican. Think about it. The vaqueros, the caballeros, the Mexican horsemen and cowmen with their lariats and their rancheros and their caballeros. All of the things that we associate with the American cowboy were really Mexican. The big hat. The corral is an anglicized word from the Mexican, as is ranch. Think about all the terms that we associate with the cowboy, and virtually all of them came from the Mexicans. So the American cowboy really just borrowed from the Mexican vaqueros. The use of the rope, the Western saddle with the pommel in the front to wrap the rope around when you were roping cattle, the big hat or sombrero. Much of what we think of as American cowboy is really Mexican. As were the cows they herded. Cattle are not indigenous to the Americas. They were brought here originally by the Spaniards. Some escaped and became wild animals, and over the centuries, they developed defensive mechanisms like long horns. And so all of those longhorn cattle that are being rounded up in South Texas and driven by the millions to the railhead, those all derive from Spanish and Mexican herds. Sorry, UT fans, your Longhorn is not American. The same applies to many of the horses there. Remember again, the horse is not indigenous to the Americas. It was brought here first by the Spaniards. Some got away, became wild horses, the wild horse herds we know even to this day. And so it was possible for someone after the Civil War who had nothing to be able to walk to Texas, capture a wild horse, break it, and then use it to round up some of these wild cattle and set themselves up as a cattleman, as a rancher. In the early days of ranching in Texas, it was known as open range ranching because the cows were just rounded up about once a year. The cowboys would go out, find all of these wild animals, herd them together. The calves that had been born during that year would be branded, and then they would select the cattle that they wanted to take to market. The rest of the cattle would be released, where they were on their own for the next year to graze and get fatter. The ones that were selected to be taken to market were then formed into trail drives, driving this herd of wild or at least semi-wild animals from south of San Antonio all the way to Kansas. This is the famous Texas Trail Drive. So the cowboys would take this herd of wild or semi-wild longhorn cattle, and it was their job to manage them, to drive them over 1,000 miles to the nearest railroad. And this was when they would get their payoff, because once they got the cattle to the railhead, then they could be sold and the cowboys would be paid. But remember, the cowboy was a low-paid agricultural worker. This is a map of Fort Worth, Texas in 1876. You can see the courthouse there. Yes, there's a different building there now, but it's the same courthouse square on the banks of the Trinity River. You can see Main Street and Belknap and Weatherford Streets. This became the destination for the cattle drives. Fort Worth became the destination because in 1876 the railroad arrived in Fort Worth. Now the cattle didn't have to be driven all the way to Kansas to be loaded onto cars and taken to the cities to provide beef for the factory workers to eat. And initially, that's the way cattle were shipped, alive. But then an invention in the 1880s changed that. The refrigerated railroad car allowed the meat packing companies to build factories in the stockyards of Fort Worth. If you go to the stockyards today in Fort Worth, all those big red buildings, those were the meat packing plants. And so Fort Worth became one of the largest livestock markets in the world, not for just cattle, but for horses and sheep. Virtually every form of livestock came to Fort Worth, where it was held in the stockyards until it was slaughtered and the meat put on refrigerated railroad cars and sent back to Chicago or Pittsburgh or New York or Boston or Philadelphia to help feed the people of the urban areas who were no longer able to produce their own food and now had to buy it. One of the aspects of the cattle drive that got so much publicity was the wild and crazy antics of the cowboys once they got to town. In the movies, they're depicted as stampeding in and firing their guns in the air and all that kind of thing. And in reality, every cattle town had an area where a cowboy could spend his money. It had things that were designed to part the cowboy from his money. So he may have worked hard for months driving those cattle, but many times he would return home with not much more money than he had come with because of these establishments designed to entertain and to provide services for the cowboys. In Fort Worth, that area was known as Hell's Half Acre. It was really about 2 acres big, situated approximately where the Tarrant County Civic Center is today. And in Hell's Half Acre, a cowboy could find any kind of way he wanted to spend his money. He could drink, he could gamble, he could find prostitutes, he could find drugs, he could buy himself new clothes, he could get a bath and a haircut, all of which, of course, he paid for. Now here's a picture of a real Fort Worth saloon in the 1880s. It does not look like the movie saloon, but it was here that the cowboy could unwind from the months on the trail. Fort Worth also played a role in bringing to justice one of the biggest outlaw groups in the Old West. Now, there are many tales of the famous outlaws of the Old West, but in reality, there were not that many, and they were not as bloodthirsty, for the most part, as they have been depicted. But in Fort Worth, Butch Cassidy and his hole-in-the-wall gang came to town. They had just robbed a bank someplace else, but because sheriffs didn't know what they looked like, after they robbed a bank in one town, they could go to another and have a party, spend the money they'd gotten from the bank. Well, they came to Fort Worth to spend their loot from a bank robbery. And one of the new businesses that had opened up in Fort Worth was a photography studio. And the gang decided it would be great to have a picture of themselves. And so they went and had this picture made. The only problem was that now their image could be known to all law enforcement. And it was the beginning of the end for the bank robbers, for the gang, and it forced Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the leaders of the gang, to flee the United States because law enforcement was after them after they took this picture in Fort Worth. But here is what the working cowboy looked like. This is Burleson County, Texas, 1860s. And you notice not all of them have guns. You'll notice that they don't have any kind of a uniform dress, except they all wear the big hats for the shade and protection of their head that it provides from the Texas sun. The American image of the cowboy has often been that the cowboy was white. But in fact, that is not correct. Hundreds of slaves, either from Texas or from other parts of the South, came to the state and became cowboys. In fact, it is estimated that as many as 25% of the cowboys working the trail drives were African American. Another 12 to 15% were Mexican. And so at least 1/3 of all cowboys were not white Americans. They were African American, Mexican American, even Indians became cowboys. But the image of the American cowboy has traditionally been that it was a white man. This video explains the true life of this agricultural worker that we called cowboys. They were poorly paid, and their working conditions were horrible. There was nothing romantic or adventuresome about being a cowboy. Take a look at the reality. The era of the cattle drives lasted no more than about 20 years. By 1890, it was over, and there were a lot of cowboys who were out of a job. And so one of these Westerners, Buffalo Bill Cody, a famous Indian fighter and scout and buffalo hunter, was looking for work. He decided to put together a circus with a Western theme, and he hired these trick ropers and trick riders and sharpshooters and took his show to the East Coast, where he put on these adventurous, exciting shows with wagon train and Indian fights and bucking broncos and all of this kind of thing for the entertainment of urban dwellers in the East. His show became so big that he even went to Europe and played for the King and Queen of England. This was one of the ways that the image of the cowboy as exciting, as adventurous, was born. Another way that the Western theme was spread throughout the country was through what were called dime novels. Think of these like graphic novels or comic books without the pictures. They were short stories of daring do, of lawmen hunting down outlaws in the West, kind of like mystery novels today. And they were hugely popular in the American cities. And it gave a lot of young men in particular the idea that being a cowboy, being free of working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in a factory, the dream of being able to go out and just get on your horse and ride as far as you could, the freedom. This began to spread the romantic image of the cowboy. One of the major factors in ending the era of the cowboy was barbed wire. Any of you who have ever been out to western Texas or Kansas or Oklahoma, you know there are not many trees out there. And so they didn't have means to build fencing. That's why open range ranching was the norm. But with the invention of barbed wire, now farmers could fence off their fields to keep the cattle from being driven through their fields. And ranchers could begin to pin in their cattle and breed better breeds of cattle and engage in animal husbandry, if you will. And so barbed wire changed the face of ranching in America. The first known demonstration of this invention, it was actually invented in Ohio, was in San Antonio in 1876, where a barbed wire salesman bet local ranchers that their cattle would not get through what appeared to the cattlemen to be just these flimsy little wires. And the cattlemen took him up on his bet. And so the salesman built a pen out of barbed wire. And the cattlemen brought their meanest and baddest bulls to put in the pen to prove that this wasn't going to contain their mean stock. But it did. And all of a sudden, Texas and the rest of cow country began to be divided up by barbed wire. Another factor was that farmers were moving onto the Great Plains as the massive herds of buffalo were killed off and the cattle drives began to become more and more in Texas. Farmers moved into Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas and began to farm. One of the things that they had to do, however, was to get rid of the prairie grass so that they could grow their corn or wheat. But they also had a problem of how were they going to build a house with no trees to be used. And what they devised was to use that sod that they cut up from the prairie so they could plant their crops to make sod houses. And so the life of the prairie farmer often revolved around this sod house where the family lived with the fields all around them, and sometimes it would be miles to the closest neighbor. And so it was a very isolated and mentally challenging life for a farmer on the Great Plains. So the myth of the cowboy as being adventurous and romantic had begun to be spread by things like the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, by dime novels, but a new invention would spread the myth of the cowboy throughout the country and the world, and that was moving pictures. The very first moving picture ever made that told a story was called The Great Train Robbery, and it was a Western. And over time, as movies developed and then television, about a quarter of all movies made before the year 2000 were Westerns. And about 20% of all television shows after 1950, between 1950 and 2000, were Westerns. And so this cowboy became a myth that many Americans came to identify with. This movie cowboy was not much like the real cowboys. And I just wonder, and I pose the question for you, does it matter? Or is it like that old Western movie that says, when the reality becomes myth, print the myth? The image of this mythical cowboy and what he stood for has become so strong that virtually every president in the 20th century wanted to be associated with the cowboy. It spoke to character. It spoke to a person that a president thought he needed to use as a symbol of his abilities. For example, Theodore Roosevelt, born and raised in a rich family in New York. But he depicted himself as a cowboy, but he was somewhat authentic because as a young man he went west and worked as a cowboy and then bought a ranch. And he felt like that the cowboy life was good for a vigorous young fellow. It's a fine, healthy life. It taught a man self-reliance, hardihood, and the value of instant decisions, having to think on your feet. Remember that term self-reliance. We will revisit that. President Calvin Coolidge from Maine wanted to be identified with cowboys. Franklin Roosevelt, also from a rich family in New York, and with polio that left him barely able to walk. But he wanted to be identified with cowboys. President Eisenhower wanted to be identified with the cowboys. Now, he had some background. Although he made his name as the commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II, he was born in Abilene, Kansas. And read here about his memory of growing up in the American West. The town had a code. That code was, meet anyone face to face with whom you disagree. You could not sneak up on him from behind. As long as you faced the same risk that he did, you could get away with almost anything, as long as the bullet was in the front. The code of the West. Of course, the Texan Lyndon Johnson identified with the cowboy. as did the Californian Richard Nixon. Ronald Reagan was originally from Illinois, but he played cowboys as a movie actor, and he came to see them as part of the dreams of our youth and the standards we aim to live by in our adult lives. Ideals of courageous and self-reliant heroes, integrity, morality, democratic values. These were the themes of the mythic cowboy, which Ronald Reagan saw as something that all Americans should follow. Bill Clinton from Arkansas also wanted to be identified with cowboys. Many of George W. Bush's detractors pointed out how often he sounded like some sheriff in a Western movie. Here's a quote where he tells Saddam Hussein to get out of Iraq within 48 hours or suffer the consequences. Hundreds of movies. You can see the sheriff of the town telling the bad guys, if you're not out of town by noon, you're going to have to face me and I'm going to kill you. So to many, this mythical cowboy becomes the symbol of what America is all about. Doesn't make a difference that this symbol is based on a myth and not reality. Think about whether these are traits that you believe are a part of America's self-image. That, like the cowboy in the movies, we never seek trouble, but if trouble arises, we will stand up and fight to defend what is right. That, like the cowboy, Americans are rugged individualists who don't like being told what to do by anybody and who can take care of themselves, don't need any government assistance. Each person can handle it. So do these characteristics of the mythical cowboy represent how Americans picture themselves? Is this part of our self-image of who we are as a people? A nation of rugged individualists, self-reliant, hard-working, thrifty, persevering, fair and just, honest and moral, brave, winners over evil. And then the cowboy in the movies was always white. In many ways, these same characteristics from the movie cowboy are reflected in our concept of American exceptionalism. That is, the United States is the pillar and the light of the world. If the rest of the world would just be more like the United States, the world would be a better place. America standing as the torch for liberty, egalitarianism, individualism, populism or democracy, and laissez-faire, government staying out of the people's business. Another area that some critics have pointed to about the mythical cowboy is that he always wore a gun and settled disputes by shooting people. Is this part of our fascination as a nation? This idea of standing up to your enemy with a gun, of protecting yourself with a gun, that was part and parcel of the symbolic cowboy of the movies, but it wasn't real. But does it matter if it was real? Do we act based on that image of who we are? So are we like the cowboys of movie and fiction? A gunfighter nation where we defend ourselves and what we believe is right because we own a handgun. Do we see ourselves as defenders of the right, defenders of democracy and self-reliance and our property? And have we exported this idea to our foreign policy? As depicted in this cartoon, it shows President George W. Bush as the local sheriff who had just gunned down Osama bin Laden. They're saying, who's next? Come on, let's get it on. The cowboy has played a huge role in the development of American culture, celebrated by Walt Disney. The Simpsons even depicts cowboys and Indians. We continue to celebrate the rodeo and the life of this cowboy. For instance, the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, held every year. A celebration of the cowboy way. And even on Sunday afternoons, we occasionally play cowboys and Indians. The reason I bring this up is it's something I want you to think about as we talk about American action in the 20th century. Have we based our actions as a nation? Is our self-image of who we are as Americans been derived from this mythical cowboy? And does it matter if the cowboy in the movies was not like the real cowboy?